brings together the ECB and national central banks of the euro area. And I'm very glad to see a full house for our event this morning, which is a joint initiative of the ECB and the IMF in the EU capital. And I would like in particular to thank James John, the IMF resident representative for Europe, for his teams in Paris and Brussels, for the excellent joint work to make it happen today. So what's on our plate this morning? Alfred Kammer, the Director, European Department of the IMF, will present the Fund Europe. Present the Fund Europe, and he will thereafter be joined by Kerstin Jorna, Director General DG GROW of the European Commission, Isabel van Stinkis, the Director General International European Relations of the EC panel, which will be moderated by Angela Barnes from Euronews. And the title of today's event is Scaling Up the Single Market to Boost Productivity, which is obviously the most topical in the aftermath of the Draghi. So thank you again for coming, and welcome to our speakers on behalf of the IMF and the ECB. And happy now to invite Alfred to the stage to highlight the IMF's latest regional economic outlook for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris, for the kind welcome, and the ECB for hosting us again today for a launch of the Regional Economic Outlook, focusing on productivity. Europe's long-awaited recovery following a sequence of unprecedented shocks has begun with an orderly disinflation process well underway in many countries. Yet, both in the short and the medium term, we see Europe's economic trajectory falling short of its true potential. Uncertainty has been causing households to refrain from spending and firms to scale back investment plans. Together, the increased caution makes for a comparatively tepid short-term recovery. And looking beyond the next few quarters, prospects are weighed down by persistently low productivity growth.
Son Marco Rubio, como es Stefanik y como es Waltz en el gobierno, en el próximo gobierno norteamericano. Esto indica que lo que quiere es asfixiar a China. El análisis de los estrategas norteamericanos cercanos a Trump es que hay que impedir que China siga desarrollándose, hay que asfixiarle y se piensa que China no va a poder ser autárquico. Este es uno de los objetivos que se ha propuesto Xi Jinping, la famosa economía de circulación dual, es decir, hacer a China menos dependiente de los mercados exteriores. Vamos a ver si eso es posible, no lo parece en estos momentos. Y Europa, lamentablemente, está muy en la periferia. Europa cada vez cuenta menos internacionalmente, atravesamos y vamos a atravesar una crisis económica muy importante. La situación de Alemania no es fácil de solucionar. Vamos a ver qué ocurre con el tema de los aranceles, sin duda que puede afectar muy gravemente a la industria europea y, por tanto, Europa ni está, lamentablemente, ni se le espera.
A partir de aquí, ¿cómo puede ir también la relación entre Estados Unidos con Trump y China en un momento en el que se prevé que haya un aumento de esos aranceles a la economía china? ¿Y cuál puede ser el efecto también en la economía estadounidense?
Vamos a ver al final qué es lo que verdaderamente se lleva a efecto. está claro que se hará un análisis muy pormenorizado de los efectos secundarios que pueden tener los aranceles a China para la economía norteamericana, que al final no dejan de estar absolutamente entrelazadas. Mucho producto chino semimanufacturado que llega a Estados Unidos. Vamos a ver, no sabemos todavía cuál va a ser la decisión final, pero está bastante claro que el proteccionismo en general siempre acaba pasando factura, y también a Estados Unidos. Son dos economías imbricadas, la globalización está ahí para quedarse. Es muy difícil que pensemos en una vuelta atrás a una situación similar a la que fue la Europa entre guerras, cuando se alzaron los aranceles, pero sin duda que va a haber una presión muy fuerte en todos los temas. Tecnología, no olvidemos que la gran guerra, la gran batalla se libra en la tecnología día a día entre China y Estados Unidos, en seguridad, sin ninguna duda, con los aliados de un lado y de otro, y estamos viendo verdaderamente una lucha permanente por ver cómo se sitúan el resto de países y qué se les ofrece, y en eso China es imbatible a la hora de ofrecer candies, de ofrecer cosas positivas para conseguir un mayor número de aliados. Y también creo que vamos a ver, incluso en temas de derechos humanos, mayor presión por parte de Estados Unidos.
Muchísimas gracias por toda esa fotografía, José María Benedito, catedrático de Derecho Internacional, presidente de la Asociación Española de Empresas de Consultoría. Buen día, buen negocio, José María.
Muy buenos días a vosotros y gracias.
Tripled in the US, reaching around 12% of sales in 2023. Looking beyond the leading firms, Europe suffers a broader lack of business dynamism. Europe's promising young firms, those which are 5 years old and or younger, tend to have a smaller footprint in the economy compared to the US. US top-performing young firms, these in the highest decile of the employment growth distribution, make up around 6 times the share of total employment of their European counterparts. Moreover, some European countries show low exit rates of unsuccessful firms. Combined, these facts explain why Europe has an overabundance of small, mature firms. European microfirms account for 20% of total employment, twice as much as in the US. What explains the subdued productivity growth among Europe's large leading firms? We find that 2 key factors matter: market size and the financing structure. Let me start with market size. The US and Europe's economies are comparable in terms of the economic size and in terms of population, each representing about 15% of the global economy. Yet, Europe's market is much more fragmented. Trade intensity between EU countries, that is cross-border trade between member countries in ratio to the EU's GDP, is less than half the trade intensity between US states. This gap reflects the large trade barriers still in place between EU countries. We estimate that the average cost of selling goods across EU member states is equivalent to a tariff of around 45%, while across US states this tariff equivalent is about 15%. That is, the estimated cost of trading goods across US state borders are about 1/3 of the cost of trading between EU member states. And even larger barriers exist for services, with an estimated tariff equivalent of about 110% on average. Faced with these barriers, European firms have a hard time exploiting economies of scale and network effects as much as US firms do. This is particularly detrimental in high-tech sectors, leveraging digital technology, where competition often takes the form of a winner-takes-all. According to our calculations, deeper market integration would be a game changer for productivity. The direct impact of lowering intra-EU trade barriers to the level observed between US states could increase the level of productivity by almost 7% in the long term. Gains could be larger should the reduction in barriers also unlock efficiency gains through reallocation towards the most productive sectors in each country. The second factor holding back productivity is the fact that the financing model of Europe's leading firms is simply not supportive of innovation. For a given firm size, US-listed firms rely twice as much on equity financing as EU-listed firms. Higher reliance on equity finance is particularly helpful to fund the intangible investments which underpin innovation and productivity gains in the tech sector and increasingly in non-tech as well. Limited access to equity markets for European firms makes their research and development investments more vulnerable to shocks. This hurts particularly those types of innovations that require steady funding over lengthy time periods. But innovations that push the productivity frontier come not just from large and established firms. They also come from disruptive new entrants that challenge incumbents and may themselves become the future leading firms. Their disruptive innovations also typically...
En directo, el director general del Departamento de Europa del Fondo Monetario Internacional, Alfred Kammer, en una comparecencia sobre los retos, los desafíos a los que se enfrenta Europa, una Europa ante el precipicio que tiene que determinar ese mercado único. Habla algunos de los diagnósticos, Alfred Kammer, como la sobreabundancia de microempresas en el viejo continente, que representan aproximadamente el 20% del tejido empresarial total, el doble que en Estados Unidos. También explica que el tamaño de las empresas determina la competitividad, un mercado europeo mucho más fragmentado, un comercio transfronterizo que en este caso es inferior al de Estados Unidos y además Europa cuenta con diversas barreras comerciales, dificultades para explicar en este caso y que es perjudicial, sobre todo, dice Alfred Kammer, el sector tecnológico. También señala que una integración más profunda cambiaría la competitividad de Europa y podría aumentar, en este caso incluso dice un 7% a largo plazo. Las ganancias podrían ser mayores si se eliminan determinadas barreras.
Injections lead recipient European firms to double their intangible investments within a year. Let me wrap up by summing up what we see as key reform priorities to strengthen growth and close Europe's productivity and income gap with the US. In the short term, European policymakers need to do their part in reducing elevated uncertainty. In advanced Europe, this means a smooth loosening path for monetary policy and implementation of the new fiscal rules to ensure buffers are in place when future shocks hit. When it comes to durably lifting potential growth, Europe has the power to shape its own future, but this will require decisive action. A deeper single market will be key to unleash growth for Europe's most productive firms. There is scope for expanding firms' market access within Europe by addressing underinvestment in border infrastructure, opening up protected sectors, pursuing further services trade liberalization, and harmonizing regulations. Efforts to lower trade barriers should be accompanied by advancements towards the EU Capital Markets Union. Many of the required reforms would better harness Europe's considerable savings and increase the availability of equity financing for firms of all sizes. Easing barriers to labor mobility, for example, through greater pension portability, could promote innovation clusters that require talent agglomeration. Indeed, research shows that workers' cost of migrating between EU countries is about 8 times higher than for migration between US states. But improving business dynamism also requires strong domestic efforts that match EU-level ambitions. Easing remaining administrative barriers to entry would help more people start businesses, especially in services sectors. Tax and regulatory incentives for small firms should be made temporary to incentivize firms' growth. Finally, Supporting tertiary education and addressing skills mismatches are critical to foster ideas creation through new firms and technology adoption by existing businesses. The EU must find common ground for removing barriers to goods, services, capital, and labor flows within the single market. These efforts will need to span multiple areas, opening protected sectors, lowering regulatory costs of operating across borders, expanding the capital markets for innovative ventures, and investing in education. And this is no small endeavor, even more so at times of rising fragmentation and limited political appetite for reform. But a thriving business sector grounded in a more integrated market can help close Europe's large productivity and income per capita gaps, while also delivering more economic resilience. And that second part is important. It's not only about increasing per capita GDP through enhancing productivity, but this is also key in strengthening economic resilience, which is so essential in this more shock-prone world. And for us, the advice is it is critical to tackle this agenda now. It's a big one, but it can be done. Thank you.
Caso europeas, recordemos, para habilitar nuevas políticas y tener un mercado más competitivo. Recordaba también hablar de incentivos fiscales, de incluso una reducción de la movilidad laboral, mayor portabilidad de las pensiones. Dice que podría contribuir a una mejora del dinamismo empresarial. También decía Alfred Kammer que deben encontrar en Europa un terreno común para eliminar obstáculos, bajando la regulación, expandiendo el mercado de capital para las empresas innovadoras, además de una mayor inversión en educación. Y por último, recordaba que un mercado más integrado puede ayudar a cerrar las grandes brechas de ingresos en Europa y al mismo tiempo una mayor resiliencia económica. Decía un aspecto clave, Alfred Kammer, esencial para este mundo más propenso a la crisis, ya que no solo aumentaría su PIB, sino también su productividad.
Have with us Isabel van Steenkist, DG International and European Affairs at the European Central Bank. Thank you very much to our guests for joining us for this panel discussion. So thank you, Alfred, as I was saying, for the extensive analysis of the new IMF's regional economic outlooks. If I could first of all pick up on that. As the title says, the report highlights that Europe's recovery remains below its full potential. And you've listed a number of bottlenecks, small market size, insufficient capital market financing for large and those younger firms, skilled labour shortages. But Alfred, what comes first? What is most important on your list? A difficult one to narrow down.
So first of all, let me say on this question, we have the good thing is in Europe we have a broad agreement on the diagnostics of what needs to be done. The second one, when it comes to many of these reform efforts, they have been in place for some time, and reforms are going on. And when you're asking me to prioritize, I think the key issue is actually that we need to simultaneously move on many of these reforms area forward. They have been in place. They will need time to generate the results, but it's political decisions which in the end need to be taken. And I should also say the reason why it is important to move forward simultaneously is because these reforms are supporting and leveraging each other. When you're looking, just one example, what we are saying with regard to leading firms, that internal market barriers should drop so that they can produce to scale, that they will have a larger customer base, which will allow them to invest more in R&D, like their American counterparts, and become more innovative. That would be supported at the same time if you are lowering market barriers for the entry of young, new firms. Because what young firms and new firms are doing, they're usually highly disruptive, and they're going to challenge the leading firms. And so by having this additional pressure on a competition to these leading firms, which growth you're already unleashing, you're creating more pressure for innovation, more productivity growth, and a higher increase in living standard. So reforms are supporting themselves. And maybe a second point to make here, we are now talking mostly about EU-wide reforms. And of course, they're supported by the national reform efforts, especially on labor market reform, but on many other reforms. And both sets of reforms are supporting each other and need to interact and are supporting this larger objective. And if you allow me to prioritize a bit of the saying we shouldn't, what is key right now is that we are moving on the capital markets union. When you're looking at our report, financing is key for larger firms. Financing is key for the smaller firms. They need equity financing, and that's something which is not that much available in Europe. And particularly what is missing is at scale venture capital financing.
Absolutely, indeed. Capital Markets Union has been something we've talked about a lot in the last few years, and I'm sure, as you say there, it's very much on the agenda.
Alfred Kammer sigue desvelando algunas de esas recetas, ahora también en un coloquio en el que le preguntaban cómo podrían mejorar la competitividad de la Unión Europea, y recordaba que al menos hay unanimidad en el viejo continente entre los principales líderes en el diagnóstico y en las medidas que hay que implementar, que además asegura que esos esfuerzos llevan en marcha desde hace mucho tiempo. Señalaba Alfred Kammer que si se reducen las barreras del mercado permitiría la entrada de empresas más jóvenes, altamente disruptivas, lo que conduciría a una mayor productividad, lo que conduciría a un aumento mayor en el nivel de vida de los ciudadanos europeos. Para ello, recordaba, es necesaria una reforma del mercado laboral, pero también más reformas que se complementen, que se apoyen mutuamente y que necesitan actuar y apoyar ese objetivo, la unión del mercado de capitales, uno de los aspectos que todavía no está implementado en el seno de la Unión Europea. Dice, la financiación es clave para las empresas más grandes, pero también para las más pequeñas, y eso es algo, señala, que no está disponible en Europa.
Compare. This being said, if we have potential to get better, we should, of course, do that. And I mean, if you want to summarize at least what I will be doing in the next 5 years, it's we mean business. We mean business in the single market, and to get that potential for our companies in the big transformation that they are doing by looking at the business case itself. And any business case is always the same. It's inputs like raw materials, it's energy, it's access to capital, it's access to skills, and it's access to market. And this is the prism which we will use. We first introduced it with the Critical Raw Materials Act. We now have the Net Zero Industry Act, which looks at the production, how to improve the business case for clean products, for example, like solar panels, wind turbines, and we will continue to do this for other areas. And that prism, that perspective, gives us new insights that address actually the obstacles that you see, but not because we have to do a reform and everybody pushes back, but because it's the economy is stupid. 2 examples I want to make. Permitting. What holds back investment in Europe, in particular in clean tech, we did this analysis, is the fact that it takes ages to get it permitted, your operating license. And on top of it, you know, it depends where you go. In some countries, it's only years, in others, it's decades, in particular in the raw materials realm. So what we proposed in our Net Zero and Critical Raw Materials Act is that we harmonize, and that there is the same permitting procedure wherever you are in Europe. And the same permitting procedure is digital, cutoff dates. I mean, it's really state of the art. and clear deadlines. So as an investor, you know, after 12 months, you know whether it will fly or not. And if it doesn't, you can move to another project. This pushed away 30 years of dogma on subsidiarity. You know, EU regulates, member states implement. Here we actually managed to implement, and with the directly applicable law, the same permitting procedure. So we will continue on that path. The second example I'd like to give is what was adopted yesterday, the e-declaration for posting of workers. So we have rules for posting of workers. These rules are good. They are single market rules. But then comes what you said, the implementation cost. And because the implementation is so fragmented, every member state has a declaration system. And they ask for more than 300 data points, but not the same. So if you're a company, it's a nightmare. You know, you sell a machine and then you have to repair the machine and your people can't go. So holding up the mirror, we looked at this and we propose now that for the member states that want, they can use the same declaration model and the same platform for actually digitally doing these declarations. Our estimates are that it will reduce by 4 the cost of, you know, your, I mean, at least it's temporary, labor mobility. So meaning business means we will not maybe look totally from your reform angle, but from where, and that's your priority question, where do we have to prioritize? Where do we have to go to make it easier? I mean, the posting, the permitting, and let me say a word on the financing, totally true. It's not a question of that there's not enough money around. I think that's similar to the US, but it's what risk does that money take? And we have developed, and I think we're pretty much leading globally on that, a de-risking tool where we would actually look, you know, not at how much money do you need and you get it, and we would look at such a bottle and we would say, what is the risk this is the project, what's the risk you can take, and which is the risk, you know, nobody takes on this part, and can we work to take with public money only that risk, that the rest is your skin in the game, and then we unleash the project. And this de-risking idea, rather than looking at throwing money, but looking at how much de-risking you need and in what form. Is it a pari passu thing? Is it a, you know, first lost piece? Is it maybe going in on the equity side, which is very expensive? But it allowed us with the Juncker Fund to use 30 billion, which we blocked in our guarantee fund, and to do 535 billion investment in Europe. Still not the super risky one. But now we have a better idea on the risks, because if you look at the transformation of a company, the decarbonization, there are always 3 main types of risk. The first is, I have my installation. It hasn't maybe been written off. So that's a sunk cost risk, which makes investors go away. Then I have the innovation risk. So I want to produce my steel in a different way. It means I need to use a new technology. And my investor will say, do you know how to do this? I have to answer, well, no, yes. And that's an innovation risk. And the third risk I have is my market risk, because I will produce possibly the same product, but more expensive, because this investment of the new technology I will have to recuperate. Green steel today is 1,000 euro a ton. Chinese steel, dirty steel, 400 euro a ton. Of course, you see where the market take-up will be. So we will have to look at how to de-risk with the little public money we have the different these risks in a smart way. And I believe that will attract capital to do more risking with us. If I look at the risk profile of what we've done with the EIB under the InvestEU compared to what we did before, you know, we all collectively learn, and there is a smarter risk taking, which in fact is in the US. And this brings me to my last point, capital markets union. Yes, of course we need it, but you know, we've looked, I think, at the wrong corner for the last decade or so, which is the institutional stuff. Now we are trying to start with our de-risking models to do it the other way. We have 300 million pilot out there where we say to pension funds, let's do asymmetric de-risking. They say, hey, what? So we say, yes, we cap your risk, you know, the risk you cannot take because of your prudential rules and all of this. But if there's an upside, you can keep it because we're the public. We don't want the full share of it. It's completely overwritten, this, and oversubscribed. But why do we do this? Not because we want to give away money, because we want pension funds to learn how they can manage risks they've never looked at because they thought they couldn't. Problem is that actually our financial services regulation says asymmetric risks, I don't recognize that. You need to underlay it with a very high capital cost. So we're trying to fix that. But this would be another way to get to the Capital Markets Union and have this risk taking. So in conclusion, yes, there are challenges. Yes, there is a lot of optimization we can still get out of the single market. And yes, we mean business.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on that. That's incredibly interesting. Permitting procedures across Europe was something I heard recently in a conference I attended, and many.
Acaban de escuchar a la directora del Mercado Interior Europea, Kerstin Jorna, rompiendo una lanza a favor de los avances que se han producido en la Unión Europea, como el de la detección y la identificación de riesgos. Hablaba Kerstin Jorna de equilibrar riesgos para facilitar préstamos. Si en algo Europa es campeona es en mejorar la gestión de riesgos. Además señalaba que hay 3 tipos de riesgo: el riesgo de coste, el riesgo de innovación y el riesgo de mercado, el riesgo de producir un mismo bien o servicio. Y ponía un ejemplo, el de los 1.000 euros por tonelada del acero verde europeo frente al acero chino. En este caso, más de la mitad de barato, en este caso hasta 400 euros la tonelada de acero chino. Dice que eso permite atraer inversiones, la gestión de los riesgos, algo de lo que Europa es líder, porque limitar los riesgos es otro de los avances de la regulación financiera y, en definitiva, para volver a fortalecer el sistema y acometer mayores reformas. No obstante, también decía Kerstin Jorna que la reforma del mercado laboral podría conducir a mejores reformas, pero rompía una lanza a favor de esa gestión del riesgo para facilitar préstamos y mejorar, en definitiva, el tejido empresarial.
Also better able to compete on the global market. I mean, a company that has trained in its domestic market first before going globally and is already a strong domestic company, then of course also has an easier time in the global market. So this is all the kind of efficiency gains that we also normally talk about. But in the current environment, where we may be not in the first best world anymore, where everybody plays necessarily always by the multilateral rules, we also need to think of resilience, right? And this is the case where the single market, there's no trade-off, right? It gives you resilience and it gives you efficiency. There are cases where you can maybe gain more efficiency, but it makes you less resilient, right? For instance, if you're talking about trading and maybe we import from one partner who is the most cost efficient, but that doesn't make us resilient, right? So that's a case where we say there will be a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. On the single market, you're not faced with this kind of trade-off. So from that perspective, it's a win-win on both areas. Now at the ECB, some colleagues of ours have also done some research trying to uncover the benefits of the single market. I think there's many studies out there, right? But what they did is looking at those countries that were part of the single market and to what extent their GDP per capita, as we take as a proxy for welfare, increased relative to those who were not in the single market. And so between 1993 and 2008, GDP per capita for those in the single market was 12 to 21% higher. And then we're talking about an incomplete single market, right? So if we then project what, a full completion of the single market to bring, it definitely would bring welfare gains, right? Now, a final question is then, when we say it's a no-brainer at a macro perspective, why is it not happening, right? Of course, it's because winners and losers are unevenly distributed. And of course, those companies that are less efficient may be competed out of the market. But from an aggregate perspective, you get the benefits, and the question is, how do you distribute and bring basically everybody on board on this project, which is very important.
And a big challenge ahead. Isabel, thank you very much indeed. Alfred, if I...
En directo acaban de escuchar a Isabel Bantenkiste, la directora general de Relaciones Europeas e Internacionales del Banco Central Europeo, reconociendo que el mercado único está incompleto, pero que su finalización atraerá ganancias, ya que las empresas podrían ser mucho más eficientes. También recordaba las declaraciones de Kerstin Jorna sobre cómo identificar riesgos y también sobre cómo fortalecer y reducir la elevada incertidumbre en el seno de la Unión Europea, la sobreabundancia de las empresas, que muchas de ellas se quedan incluso sin cuantificar dentro de esas pérdidas, y también dice que el tamaño del mercado determina la competitividad.
The losers and mitigate the risks during the recession. So all of the reforms are terribly complex, and they are terribly difficult to undertake on the political side. When we are talking to eliminate barriers between countries, when we are talking about lowering restrictions for trade, licensing requirements, etc., this is not easy to overcome, so you need to make the case. Even if you move to the 28 regime as a solution of cutting through some of that complex reform effort, you need countries to agree on. So that is clear. I think what has been missing so far is, and I think Isabel, you pointed to it, there are huge benefits generated by being in the single market because of the market size you're getting. And these benefits are accumulating to the populations. And there are benefits of undertaking structural reforms, again, because of the productivity increases you get. And just to emphasize on Kerstin points, this is not an issue of changing the European social contract. This is to unleash efficiency gains. This is not about more work hours. This is not about changing the system. This is money on the table, which could be taken and benefit the population if these reforms are undertaken. And I think that case needs to be taken, made by politicians. And I think where we have a bit of a shortfall in making this case is when I look at European reforms, that case is usually not being made domestically. Policymakers are focusing on their national reforms. They are trying to get coalitions together. They're trying to compensate the losers. With the European reforms, that case domestically is not being made. And that makes it much harder to undertake European reforms. And on top of that, you need to have 27 member countries going for the same reforms, making the same arguments, and overcoming the obstacles. So I think that is key. And for that, we are trying to make the arguments why this is so beneficial for everybody involved to get these efficiency gains.
Not an easy task, Isabel, if I can just come back to you.
Kammer, Alfred Kammer, en este caso hablando de los enormes beneficios que supondría estar en el mercado único, hablando de los beneficios para emprender reformas estructurales que conducirían a un aumento de la productividad, porque dice no se trata de cambiar la sociedad europea, sino de dar rienda suelta a aumentar la eficiencia. Y también señalaba que los formuladores de políticas están más centrados en sus reformas nacionales. En estos momentos interviene Isabel van den Kisten, la directora general de Relaciones Europeas e Internacionales del Banco Central Europeo.
So the free movement of capital would be a very important one, but there are others, of course, right? So there's also the free movement of payments. That is important. I mean, we don't have currently one single mean, right, that is accessible across Europe for all. And that is very rare, right? Because having a monetary union in perspective and not having a single means of payments in the digital world that is available for all citizens is a gap, basically. But there's also an important aspect that hasn't come up yet, which is the integration of energy markets, right? And of course, if you look in Europe, the interconnectedness across national barriers is still lacking, right? So, you know, this kind of grid-dependent energy sources, connecting them better would bring great benefits. And I'm going to jump to a different continent to make my point. And actually, Chile engaged into a project of doing that, right? So they had a very badly interconnected energy grid, and they did really big investments to make that happen. if you take a map of Chile and you look at electricity prices across Chile before the integration, you had many areas that were very red, so very expensive, and others that were, let's say, very green because they were very cheap. After the integration, electricity prices were cheaper across the whole country, right? Because you had far less waste of electricity, because electricity cannot just always be stored so easily, right? And basically electricity was and you had less volatile prices as well, right? So the potential that we would have there, which would help competitiveness, but also price volatility and more resilience, would be very big, right? Another one is, of course, reducing the barriers, the regulatory barriers for goods and services, and we already mentioned all these barriers that we have are important. And then I want to add to all of this a little bit of an additional spice, which is digitalization, right? And digitalization brings a lot of potential also for integrating the single market. It also provides risks, right? So, and a good example is when you look at the digital market for assets, basically, right? So currently we have an EU pilot regime on that, right, which we're testing. And having a market for digital assets, a more integrated market for digital assets, can get you around a lot of the issues that we talk about in the Capital Markets Union, about lack of harmonization of regulations. And so that would very much facilitate that, right? But of course, there's also a risk that if we don't integrate well on the digital side, we will end up with the same fragmentation that we have on the physical assets also in the digital world, right? So it's a great opportunity that we have to accelerate the integration, but if we don't use the opportunity, we also actually may create further fragmentation. Of course, the same is true on the payments, which I already alluded to, right? So the digital euro would be a great opportunity, for instance, and of course, I'm also mentioning that because it's a project where the ECB is very much engaged into, but the digital euro gives you the opportunity to have a single means of digital payment across the Eurozone. If you don't take that opportunity, the risk is that we have a very fragmented landscape on the payment side, right? So we may even create more fragmentation. So opportunities and risks there, and I think we should really seize the digitalization movement to make these opportunities happen.
Excellent, Isabel, thank you very much. And
Isabel Bantes-Quiste, en este caso, hablando de algunas ideas que podrían conducir a una mayor competitividad en la Unión Europea. Una de ellas es la capacidad de almacenamiento de la electricidad. Hay mucho potencial que tendría además y ayudaría a la productividad, a reducir la volatilidad de los precios de la energía. La otra cuestión que sacaba a la palestra Isabel Bantes-Quiste, en este caso, es la digitalización potencial, que trae mucho potencial la digitalización para la integración del mercado único. Dice, tenemos un régimen piloto que estamos probando, los activos digitales pueden sortear muchos problemas, pueden solucionar muchos de ellos. Además, dice, podría terminar con la fragmentación que se observa en los activos físicos. Y también decía, soy partidaria del euro digital, creo que traerá grandes oportunidades y defendía férreamente un único medio de pago digital.
To where the law, the compliance issue hits the companies. Because there's the implementation. I mean, first of all, we have laws that, yes, 27 out, but then 27 come in again because member states fill the gaps, or they say, this is the so-called gold plating, or they say, in order to implement this. I don't know if I were to ask you how many data protection authorities exist in the EU. You would probably not know this, 200. How many of those are in Germany? You would probably also not know, 10% of those. So, I mean, member states in the implementation of the one EU rule, they actually create a maze, and let's say we create it together because the EU law leaves the space. And then the SMEs, wherever they are, they're in the maze. And it gets worse if they want to go to another maze, to another member state. So what we are really trying to do here is to cut through the maze. My example, which I just gave on the e-declaration, was actually a taboo. I mean, 5 years ago, people would have said you're crazy because it gets involved in what member states do. It gets involved in, you know, the platform that we're building, which would be a joint platform. So EU money pays for implementation of EU laws, which was also a taboo area. The single permitting, total taboo area, because we're actually imposing a permitting procedure. And now actually we're building the digital containers that member states can also put into their national legislation. So we are, can I use the word, federalizing parts of the implementation as well. And that is around the whole simplification piece that for SMEs. Also, we, in our legislation, we have certain carve-outs for SMEs where we say you don't have to, but they're inefficient because there's a trickle-down effect. If I'm an SME, my client is a big company, the big company has to report. So how can they report about the supply chain unless they ask me? So bam, I'm hit again. We are trying to facilitate, the interface with easier reporting standards, for example, for the SMEs. Also, when there's a real carve-out, I have to prove I'm an SME. Yes, we have, common rules, definition of an SME, but how do I prove it? And we did a research, how much time it costs for an SME to prove that they're an SME, and how much time it costs for whoever is to give the benefit of whatever to the SME in the law. And we came that every single operation on the side of the SME is 5 hours. And on the side of the administration, it varies, but some administrations are very diligent. So it took them kind of a day to check. For every single time I have to prove I'm an SME. That's absurd. So we're now working on an SME passport that, like our COVID thing, we would be able to prove it. When the SME is in the business of selling products, we are introducing the digital product passport, which means that the data is with the SME and stays on the product. It can be read out through this digital product passport, but there is no longer, I don't know in how many languages, giving these big paper chunks to these market surveillance authorities to say, I'm doing this. So the data stay with the companies, they have them anyhow, and they are actually pulled through the passport. I personally think that we will move from, here's the document which proves whatever it has to prove, to a stage where actually data will be pulled, to your point about the digitization, where the data will be pulled and there is kind of automatic reporting. We are working with this on this with the Danish presidency. And, the macro level says introduce digitization, but the micro level actually has to think about how do I structure these data, where are they, and how do I connect administrations and private to use these data. And that, I think, will be a big piece for us as well to do. It will completely blur the easy borderlines EU legislation member states implement. We will have to talk about money as well, because member states, they always say, I can't pay for more staff, it's all too much to implement, but then they don't give us money either. This is a structural problem that we're making an economic, we're in fact the economic ministry of the single market, but we have no money. We need to ask our 27 mothers-in-law to give us a bit of money, which they never do. So we are trying to be creative with the de-risking part, use the little we have to have more impact. We are also trying to make sure that the 27 don't spend it, completely unstructured. We're trying to align them to bring, that's the idea about the competitiveness fund, that, there would be the competitiveness fund, but that member states would be able to put in. It's the idea of auction as a service. So we auction for hydrogen, but member states can put in money, and then we have one process, and that's much more efficient, and it's a bigger market also for the producers and the users of hydrogen. So your scale argument. We have the IPSAs, which is the state aid tool, where you can actually do things you were not allowed to do under state aid. You can go until first deployment and full financing, but you have to do it together. And we are leveraging that now. You have to do it together to make sure that member states actually invest their public money into the same public good. We have something like 30 billion joint, so no cent from us, 30 billion from the member states together on, creating the hydrogen economy. And that's how we're trying to overcome some of the structural issues. And to the point on the SMEs, when we say we mean business, the business is the SMEs. And by taking that perspective, that will also allow us to develop better tools. Last example, come back to my favorite. I'm a bit the mother of InvestEU. So InvestEU, we have out there now a 5.5 billion pilot for sustainability financing of SMEs. We're working with our partners, EIB, EIF, obviously, but also with our other partners that we have under InvestEU to actually give these small loans that are with consulting, with analysis, that help SMEs to transform. In the big scheme of things, people say, the small ones, but also the small ones will have to transform and to adapt. So we're having this huge guarantee. It's currently running. We hope that there will be a lot of take-up, a lot of products, and it's our partners that will reach the SMEs and that they know what SMEs take. And that will no longer have this excuse to say, this is too small for me. So, because we're kind of taking the risk as well. So these are concrete things, but it comes back to my point. We mean business. This is the difference.
Excellent plans. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for sharing.
Kirsten Giorna señalando algunas de las recetas y señalando algunos tabúes en el seno de la Unión Europea, como el de los permisos únicos. Dice que en nuestra legislación tenemos ciertos problemas en la cadena de suministro y hablaba de algunos puntos de partida, como el COVID-19, que posibilitó la implementación de un pasaporte digital, y es una punta de lanza de la que rascar y seguir acelerando en nuevas medidas. Dice, trabajamos en ello porque sabemos el potencial de introducir la digitalización tanto a nivel micro como a nivel macro en cómo estructuramos los datos, porque dice hacerlo difuminará fronteras que las fronteras que implementen en este caso la legislación de la Unión Europea de 27 Estados miembros. Dice, hace falta dinero para tener un mayor impacto en ello, y en ese sentido hablaba del Fondo de Competitividad para producir hidrógeno, una herramienta de ayuda estatal que está en pleno proceso de financiación. Dice que asegurará que los Estados miembros invierten su dinero en un mismo bien público. Hablaba de 30.000 millones de dólares de los Estados miembros para crear, dice, la economía del hidrógeno. También hablaba Kirsten Giorna de financiación sostenible de las pymes, de conceder pequeños préstamos para transformarse y adaptarse. Esas son algunas de las recetas de la directora general de Relaciones Europeas e Internacionales del Banco Central Europeo. Retoma la palabra, en este caso, Alfred Kammer, el director del Departamento de Europa del Fondo Monetario Internacional.
Innovate more, and they are on the frontier and they're pushing out the frontier. So this helps without costing anything. It helps these leading firms to push on the frontier. Add to that a big argument we're making on business dynamism. You need your young, dynamic firms and the startups. When you're looking at the US, they have a larger employment share than the European firms, and they're attracting and agglomerating skilled labor. And I think that's another big issue going forward in the future when we are looking at AI, when we're looking at automation. There will be change. You need to upskill, reskill labor constantly. And you need to have this skilled labor agglomerate where you have innovative firms. And young firms are one of these catalysts you have. So when you're looking at all of that, then add the financing part in the end. And that equity financing is hugely helpful for firms which are producing intangibles. That can be in the tech sector, that can be in the services sector, because bank lending is not really geared towards intangibles. And when you're looking at these firms, marginal costs of producing in the tech sector are close to zero. Again, scale matters there, but they need equity financing to go through volatile periods, through loss-making periods. And especially young firms need venture capital, i.e. investors who can take the risks of losing their money in order to have them going. So we need to reduce the barriers in order to get rid of the fragmentation in the single market and to have a truly integrated single market. We need to have the capital, which Kerstin said exists. And of course, Europe is exporting savings to the US right now. And Europe has a free capital market, a free capital inflow regime. So US capital can be deployed also in Europe. But it needs to have these projects identified, and that money needs to be able to flow to these projects. And finally, the skilled labor is also key. Because in the end, that will drive productivity. And that's a big undertaking everywhere for the future with AI coming, with automation coming, that we need to think about reskilling of labor and then in deploying those labor at those firms which are most productive and shifting the innovation frontier.
Excellent, Alfred. Thank you very much. If I can come to you, Isabel, and focus on economic fragmentation in Europe for this question. The IMF
parts don't play by the rules of the game, how should you act in that regard? No? Still, I mean, even here, actually, we're coming back to the recommendation from the IMF that the single market is actually the best answer to that. Having, again, a bigger domestic market already is the best way of shielding you from this kind of fragmentation risks globally, let's say. Now, of course, that doesn't rule out that maybe there are exceptional targeted cases where you can see industrial policies are as warranted. But I mean, they need to be very limited. They need to be well studied and time bound, right? So otherwise, you really put at stake the single market. And I think that's nobody's intention. And that was also not the intention of the Commission. And I see Kerstin also agreeing to that. I mean, that was definitely not their intention. So in that sense, I think the criticism is not a criticism per se. It's more a warning that whatever was introduced should stick to this kind of rules of keeping it within bounds.
And if I can just pick up as well, how do you think, how would it increase?
Acaban de escuchar a Isabel Banterskiste, la directora general de Relaciones Europeas e Internacionales del Banco Central Europeo, hablando no tanto de una crítica, sino de una advertencia, la de protegerse en el seno de la Unión Europea frente a los riesgos de fragmentación. Y también señalaba anteriormente Kammer que necesitas a empresas jóvenes y dinámicas, startups, ya que además recordaba que Estados Unidos tiene una mayor proporción de empleo cualificado de este perfil de empresas en su tejido empresarial. Dice, cuando miramos a la inteligencia artificial, a la automatización, aquí vemos que esto produce una cualificación mayor de la mano de obra, cuando se innova, cuando las empresas jóvenes que se pueden convertir, incluso decía Alfred Kammer, en uno de esos catalizadores, y para ello la financiación de capital es enormemente útil. Hablaba de mejorar las condiciones de financiación para este tipo de perfil de empresas tecnológicas, jóvenes para reducir barreras y deshacerse de esa fragmentación en el mercado único. Dice, tenemos un mercado único para tener verdaderamente un mercado único integrado.
Across the regions, because of course there's more integration of the capital markets, and of course monetary policy is also more evenly transmitted across the region. So that all makes our job actually easier. Yeah. And then there's two other factors, which is of course the reduction in price volatility. So if prices move a lot because you're more subject to shocks, then of course it's more difficult for us to understand, is this temporary, transitory, is it more durable, what kind of shocks are we dealing with? So that's more difficult for a central bank. And then the final one is of course this increasing of the potential growth, right? Which comes to this elusive concept of R-star that central banks like to talk about a lot, but it puts us, further away, let's say, from the lower bound. And of course, being closer to the lower bound, if you have negative shocks, it makes it a bit more difficult to conduct monetary policy. Not impossible, because we have done so, right? But it makes it more difficult, right? So having a higher potential growth also makes the job of the central bank easier. So for us, as central bankers, we would very much welcome a single market also from the selfish monetary policy perspective, beyond the general welfare enhancing perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Isabel. And indeed, the markets do not like shocks either. We've seen that. Kirsten, if I can come back to you, regarding today's IMF report as well, I wanted to ask you a question about that. And it highlights the role of smaller markets and limited equity financing as bottlenecks continue to hold back Europe's large leading firms from scaling up and innovating, as Alfred has also talked about there. The regulatory environment, of course, has come up many times as a key factor, limiting growth in the EU. How is DG GROW ensuring frameworks remain conducive to innovation and entrepreneurship?
Well, number one is that we're also in charge of intellectual property, and we pulled it off. In fact, Michel Barnier pulled it off after 40 years of negotiation, not him personally. He only said to the Parliament, I'm not the first commissioner to do this, but I'll be the last, and he was. So we have the unitary patent, which is one procedure, one patent for almost the whole single market. I mean, we still have some outstanding, but I hope that the FOMO part, the fear of missing out part, will also play here. It dramatically reduced the cost for getting a patent, an intangible asset in Europe. And it's combined with, I would say, the most state-of-the-art jurisdiction, single jurisdiction as well. So you defend your patent in, for the whole, you don't need to defend it in different territories. And the uptake of this new tool, which again, it took 10 years then to implement after 40 years of negotiation, but now the uptake is very strong. And what we are very much promoting is this as a collateral, as a recognized collateral for these innovators. So in order to attract also capital. Equity, yes, we need more, but we need it from the risk-taking point of view. And from a risk-taking point of view, my InvestEU is unfortunately not so useful, because the guarantee you have to block against it is very expensive. So you can just as well give maybe a grant, but I mean, a grant is not good either. We've been experimenting with taking equity, the European Innovation Fund. I was actually also a board member in the pilot phase. But, that were small tickets, like 15 million maximum. And then it begs the question, what's your role as, when you take such a participation as a board, the board seat, who does that? Because it's not only the equity they need in the beginning, they need the advice, they need the knowledge and experience that comes with the equity and the risk taking, and that we, public, it's a bit difficult to play that role. And then we realized actually the big issue is not the small tickets, it's the big tickets when you scale up. So the bigger risk. And that's an issue we really still have to look at. What we also found, and I've also been board member at EIF and EIB, but in particular in this experience in the EIC fund, was that from an investor point of view, we don't have, a Delaware standard kind of for investors. You know, what's the term sheet? What's the what's the pay packages? What's the stock options and all of this? I leave out the taxation part. So this is part of the thinking about the 28th regime, actually, to create a single standard for investors who invest and are ready to take these risks that at the moment too few are taking in Europe, to facilitate this by having a single standard, which would be on an opt-in basis. You know, you can still do, you know, all the other things, but if we had such a standard on an opt-in basis, I think that would also facilitate attracting capital for the younger. So we work on the asset, kind of the collateral base. We work on the you bringing in investors, looking at the broader tickets. Again, here, I mean, in the last mandate, our cri de guerre was business case. I think for this, the new mandate, it will be investment journey, because also if I look at our EU budget, which is nice, 1% of GDP, we spend 30% on the very early research, you know, technical readiness levels, until level 6 or so, 30%. And then we spend 60% on the kind of procurement. You know, you just buy the stuff. And there's a big gap between TRL 6-7 and market readiness. And that's why, and that's where actually the big tickets are needed. And that's why the Spotifys of this world said, okay, guys, I go to the US, because this gap is not covered. We don't have a single or very few instruments that actually would intervene in that space, TRL 9 and, you know, first and second introduction to the market. And the idea with the competitiveness fund also is to actually imagine the investment journey from the beginning and to look at these different colors of money that you need: grant, equity, big equity, venture debt, and then kind of loans, early loans, to project that in a better way and make our EU budget also support this in a better way. Because the 30%, you could argue, are actually very bad investment, because that does not create jobs in Europe, because the jobs are created somewhere else and the products are created somewhere else. So more to do.
That's great. Thank you very much for...
Kerstin Jorna, la directora de Mercado Interior, hablando de la necesidad de atraer capital, incluso capital propio, que ayudará también a una mejor, en este caso, riesgos, una mejor calibración de riesgos, en este caso la toma de riesgos. Dice, el problema que tienen en la Unión Europea es que los tickets de inversión son pequeños y se necesitan tickets más grandes inversores, aunque eso también conlleva mayores riesgos. No obstante, la Unión Europea, en eso sí que decía que es prácticamente la campeona, la líder mundial en la gestión de riesgos. Decía, hay que crear estándares para inversores que estén dispuestos a asumir riesgos y establecer estándares e imaginar las inversiones desde el principio, diferenciar los tipos de capital, el tamaño de las deudas y, por supuesto, el tipo de préstamos tempranos para protegerse de una manera más eficaz.
Done, but so I think that I have an easier job. I can just make the recommendations. But you know, I think, you know, Alfred gave a very nice presentation here, also showing where the issues lie. And you know, there's a lot of focus on the issue lies in the tech sector, but it's actually going beyond the tech sector, right? So, I mean, what you see in Europe, you have an innovation problem. And maybe tech is where we see a lot of innovation, but if the innovation globally would have happened somewhere else, we would have shown again maybe that Europe would have lagged behind there. And that's because we lack this kind of ecosystem for innovation, right? And for that, you need on both sides to work, right? And one is, Kerstin was already mentioning a lot of it as well, is on the financing side, right? So you need to get the money channeled into innovative business. And I have here some numbers in my notes, right? So 1/3 of EU savings is invested in cash or low yield deposits. In the US, only 10%, right? In Europe, pension fund market is about 40% of GDP. In the US, it's 130% of GDP. At the same time, in Europe, we are channeling every year more than 400 billion euros of financing into equity funds outside the EU. So it's not like we don't want to invest even in equity funds or we don't want to invest, but if we do and we do a risk investment, apparently we do it outside the EU, right? So we need to create the conditions in Europe that this money is invested here and invested in well productive and projects that have a potential for the future, right? So how do we do that, right? So that's the difficult work question, and that's where the capital markets union discussion comes in, right? So we have way too uneven, let's say, levels of regulation across Europe. Tax systems, accounting systems, insolvency frameworks are very different across Europe, and even where regulatory frameworks are maybe very similar, maybe supervisory practices are not fully aligned, right? So it's all about harmonize. If you don't harmonize, we would think of it of 28 regime as an alternative, right? And basically aligning supervisory practices, potentially moving even towards centralized supervision, right? But besides, looking at the European level, what we can do, we can also learn from best practices within the EU. And I think especially when we talk about Sweden, it's always a good example of good national practices. So learning from good national practices, I think, is also a challenge in Europe that we need to take on. But that's the financing side, right? So that's one thing, is getting the money there. The other thing is basically also having the projects there, right? And so for that, you need to also create the environment for businesses to want to innovate, to want to invest, right? And so what we see in Europe is that at the fundamental research stage, right, and then universities, we're on par with the rest of the world, when we're on par with the US. It's making this into a business that is a challenge, right? And this is the financing, but it's also about the conditions, the regulations that make it difficult, the market size also, right? So even if a company then starts, it doesn't manage to scale up, and what does it do? It moves to the United States, for instance, right? So, or it's being bought by a US company, right? So we need to work on both sides. We need to work on the supply side of capital, let's say, and on the other side also on the demand side of capital, that firms actually want to invest and innovate.
A big challenge ahead indeed. And as you said as well, I know improving financial.
Isabel van der Skiste, en este caso, poniendo el foco en el sector tecnológico, aunque dice que esto va más allá, que se trata de canalizar el dinero, de atraer negocios innovadores, y también hablaba de la diferencia entre la tasa de ahorro en la Unión Europea y en Estados Unidos. Recuerda Isabel van der Skiste que tienen que crear las condiciones para favorecer las inversiones y la pregunta es cómo, y por ello dice, ahí es donde entra en juego la unión del mercado de capitales, alinear mecanismos de supervisión. Dice, se debe crear un entorno para que las empresas puedan innovar, para que quieran invertir. El reto está también, dice, en las universidades, en la regulación que, dice, dificulta el tamaño del mercado, trabajar al lado de la oferta de capital. Así es como está concluyendo este evento, Europa Ante El Precipicio, cómo ser capaces de afrontar esos desafíos, con las declaraciones de Alfred Kammer, el director del Departamento de Europa del Fondo Monetario Internacional, tratando de pulir aún más y definir aún más las reglas del juego, de fortalecer la Unión Europea. También la directora del Mercado Interior, Kerstin Jorna, e Isabel van der Skiste, la directora general de Relaciones Europeas e Internacionales del Banco Central Europeo.